As our 2020 focus, the push for equality continues, we're taking a look at your voting rights and some of the targeted attacks meant to keep voters away from the polls. Advocacy groups say voter suppression efforts have increased since 2008, but the history of restricting the vote can be traced to our country's earliest days. In the presence of a man who fought to secure every American's right to vote,
your voting rights is one of the most important things that you have.
Brenda Hale, president of the Roanoke chapter of the NAACP, can tell you the work to protect that right is far from over.
If you just think about it, why are there so many efforts to suppress it if it was not important?
Voter suppression is defined as strategies, legal or illegal, to prevent eligible voters from voting or registering to vote, efforts that have disenfranchised Virginia voters from the state's founding days.
You only had to be four things to vote. You had to be adult, white, male, and the owner of a substantial farm. That's suppression across most people who lived in the state.
The adoption of the 15th Amendment in 1870, giving black men the right to vote, spurred a new wave of discriminatory practices aimed at keeping black men away from the ballot box, especially in the South.
We saw tactics like poll taxes and literacy tests, violence and voter intimidation as well.
Brandy Faulkner, who teaches political science at Virginia Tech, says while the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and other laws have worked to eliminate those tactics, new ones have emerged.
Things like required voter identification, which certainly targets communities of color and specifically black people. We also see voter purging, which are attempts to remove voter names from lists so that they cannot vote as well.
Some say certain measures are needed to address voter fraud, despite studies that consistently show there is no widespread voter fraud.
So most of the efforts are, in fact, seem to be to dissuade certain groups of voters from participating in the political process.
Studies also show voter suppression efforts disproportionately affect minority voters, particularly black Americans. But they also make it harder for the elderly, those with disabilities, and students to vote.
It's important, I think, that we get people, young people voting.
That's why organizations, including the League of Women Voters of Montgomery County, are sharing messages to get out the vote with college students. The League has teamed up with VT Engage, Virginia Tech's Center for Service Learning, Leadership Education, and Civic Engagement, to get students registered and educated about their vote.
You are a large voting bloc, and your votes can decide this.
The statewide League of Women Voters was also a part of a lawsuit filed in mid-October to extend Virginia's voter registration deadline after a severed cable shut down Virginia's online voter registration system, creating concerns voters would be disenfranchised.
Sometimes our role is to go to court and say this must be corrected. We just urge everyone to go out and vote.
As the fight to protect your right to vote plays out in courts across the country, it's also happening with elected leaders.
Probably one of the most important things that we can do is to make sure that there is appropriate legislation that addresses these types of tactics.
It's work the NAACP has been doing for more than 100 years.
As far as voter suppression, as far as people trying to intimidate you, we will not tolerate that. And we will call on whoever we have to call on if we detect something like that is going on.
Because they say so much is at stake with every election.
We can't give up because we stand on the shoulders of all our ancestors that fought for us, they bled, and they did the ultimate sacrifice. They lost their life so we could have that right.
And in addition to registering people to vote, the Roanoke chapter of the NAACP is working to make sure people have transportation to get to the polls for early voting or on Election Day. We're now exactly 1 week away from the general election. We've posted resources at WSLS.com on what you need to know, important upcoming dates, and key issues on the ballot.